North Africa is not Africa. Well, it's come to play again with these recent developments. European leaders were recently in Tunisia to sign a memorandum of understanding aiming to curb migration to Europe. Now, according to Amnesty International, and in exchange, they offered Tunisia 105 million euros for border management and nearly 1 billion euros in additional loans and financial support amid the country's unprecedented economic crisis. Now, some people would say that if they didn't know better, they would say that the European Union is supporting Tunisia in human rights violation that has been going on for a long time now, and that is against Black Africans. Now, as Europe turns a blind eye to the growing repression of human rights in the country, Amnesty International has given a clear warning to European Union to steer clear of the situation if they cannot solve the problem. Well, today we're looking at a human rights violation in Tunisia, what has been happening with asylum seekers and refugees, as well as other migrants, and how they have been paying a heavy price due to Tunisia's actions. Joining me to have this conversation, I have with me Collins Nweke, a global affairs analyst. Thank you so much, Collins, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure, Collins. Now, going straight into the conversation, I think it's best to start by revisiting the statement that Tunisia's president made some time ago, I think some months ago, when he said that migration is going to change the demographics of the country. And that statement came as a threat to a lot of Black Africans, and even some countries started to evacuate their citizens from Tunisia. What's your thought on Tunisia's actions, especially the president's statement regarding Black Africans?
For a start, Felicity, every country in the world has the right to police its borders and ensure that there are no encroachments. Even so, in this era of terrorism and all sorts of vices, borders should not be porous. So to that extent, I believe that it is a legitimate worry, a legitimate concern for the president of Tunisia to talk about the changing face of migration. But when he does so in a manner that disparages fellow African countries, it is intolerable because he does have options. He does have options of managing migration in a very positive manner. Now, let's not make any mistake about this, Felicity. When people talk about migration, they do so from the most negative manner, forgetting, for instance, that out here in Europe, from where I'm speaking to you, positive migration, legal migration constitute well over 93% of the entire migration that you see. So it's about some 5% that actually are migrating illegally. But when you hear the way officials talk about it, including the president of Tunisia, you will begin to think that, all of the Africans, walking the streets here in Europe and to some extent North Africa are illegal migrants. That is not the case. They are contributing to the economic well-being of the countries, to the prosperity, and all of that. So that is, the negativity. It is the negativity that they accord to migration that actually makes it look as if, migrants are sending them packing from their, original homeland. That is not the case.
All right, thank you for that, Collins. Before we go ahead, I'll just like to make a very short correction. My name is Blessings. But anyways, still talking about the issue of migration, that's to say now that there is no valid reason that Tunisia or the president or the government should treat especially Black Africans inhumanely. And I think that we would agree that there is no justifiable reason for him to say that migration will change the demographics of the country, or is there?
To be honest with you, that question is meant for, Mr. President Kaisi. But if you ask me, yes, there is no demography in this world that has remained the same over a period of 1 year, 5 years, a decade, and so on and so forth. Demographics are dynamic and they continue to change every time. Now, how you respond to that change is actually what makes the difference. You can respond to the change in a manner that is actually beneficial to your country, like we are seeing in some countries of the Western Hemisphere, the UK, for instance, Canada, and the United States of America, Australia, New Zealand, and the rest of them, who are now actually importing workers from different, developing countries to be able to beef up, their well-advanced healthcare system and social systems as well. So that is migration, but managed in a manner that is positive. So you can also, choose to talk about migration as if it is the worst thing in this world. No, migration is as old as the world. And so, yes, migration is changing the demographics, but the president of Tunisia has chosen to talk about that change from a very, very disparaging and negative perspective, whereas the overwhelming majority of migration that take place actually are changing beautifully the face of these countries, in a major way.
All right. Now, speaking of the European Union's involvement, why exactly are they silent in all of this? And in fact, they're not just silent because according to Amnesty International, the EU had a meeting with Tunisia where they signed a memorandum of understanding to protect the border and even gave Tunisia a sum of, I think, 105 million pounds for border management. So is there a kind of agreement between the EU and Tunisia to curb migration, or why exactly are they, what does Tunisia have on EU that is making them so supportive of the country?
You would have to permit me, Blessings, to be a little bit politically incorrect in answering this question, because I'm going to pose another question to you. We have actually, with you and perhaps one or two other colleagues of yours, in this same program, talked about the menace of the UK actually shipping migrants to Rwanda, and the fact that Rwanda was paid, billions to be able to do that, and the fact that the court has actually, said that no, that should not be. Now, EU officials' mouths were full of condemnation of, that particular practice because it came to the limelight. Now, tell me, Blessings, is there any difference between what Rwanda and the UK did and what the EU and Tunisia are doing now, and what the EU had actually done in the past with Libya? Because even at a time when Libya was considered by all standards to be ungovernable, the EU actually signed a deal with one of the factions that was leading the country at the time, where migrants were actually stopped at the border. So you see, the EU is more and more acting in ways that make them look complicit in the abuse of human rights. Because when they signed these MOUs, and now I'm coming closer to the question that you asked, when they signed this MOU, we fail to see very strong clauses in the MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, that actually talk about monitoring, evaluation, and impact assessment of some of the actions for which they are being paid, to carry out. So you see, even the EU Ombudsman has joined the voices of people like Amnesty International crying out loud to say the EU, what you are doing here is wrong. You need to take a few steps backwards and depart completely from this policy of containment, because what they are doing is trying to contain migration rather than managing the migration. So you see, the MOU that is being signed has actually the wrong title, because this is no management of migration. It is containment of migration, and in doing so, they are pushing these migrants to more desperate, ways, as well as actually empowering the receiving country, in this case, Tunisia, to continue to perpetuate human rights abuses against these migrants while they look the other way. Deplorable.
Now that the Amnesty International has called the European Union out on their actions, do you think that they will heed the warning of Amnesty International?
If it ends at just the Amnesty International calling the EU out, they are not going to lose any sleep on it. Now, the time has come for more countries, particularly the leaders of African countries, to join this call out. But you see, we are sitting with another layer of problem because, these African countries that actually produce, these illegal migrants have lost all morality, and they do not have any single moral grounds to stand to call the EU out. But nevertheless, they now have an opportunity to begin to launder their image, because the pages of history might be full of very unholy things about them if they do not grab opportunities of this nature to begin to reinvent themselves and begin to do the right thing. I mean, start by calling out who needs to be called out. And I think when the pressure mounts, that is when the EU will begin to listen. But I think Amnesty International has set a very, very important ball rolling here. The EU Ombudsman has picked up on it and has actually requested the EU to actually show proof that there will be monitoring, there will be evaluation, and indeed that there will be ways of assessing the impacts of that policy within a very short space of time. Only then that the EU might begin to carve into the pressure.
Okay, Collins, I'll quickly like to ask, what actions can the Amnesty International or any other international body take against the EU, not even Tunisia now, if they do not heed these warnings? Are there any laws in place?
Well, I believe there are, but you don't expect the EU to be so reckless that they completely flout international conventions and so on and so forth. As a matter of fact, in a recent United Nations report, it was said that the actions of the EU is actually coming dangerously close to international violation of human rights. So which means that they might be liable, if care is not taken, of actually being called out at the International Court for Human Rights to answer for what they are doing. So I believe that just like people, organizations, and different human rights organizations actually took the UK to the courts to actually stop the shipment of migrants to Rwanda, the same needs to, at least an attempt has got to be made to bring that to bear on this obnoxious arrangement that is playing out between the EU and Tunisia. And then more things will follow. But I believe that more and more of civil society actions have got to be instituted, particularly within the European Union. They have a very strong, civil society organizations. They need to, brace up and confront the EU on this.
Now, Collins, human rights abuse and discrimination against Black African migrants or refugees in Tunisia did not start today. Let me joggle your memory. It's been going on since 2011, and in 2016, 3 Congolese students were stabbed to death by Tunisians, and that was what birthed the establishment of Organic Law Number 50 that eliminates racial discrimination in Tunisia. Now, my point is, why hasn't it stopped? And what's to say that this time there'll be any difference, whether or not they call the EU or Tunisia out on their actions?
The reason it hasn't stopped is essentially what I told you earlier, which is that, if it stops at just a release like the one that Amnesty International has done without a follow-up, it is going to be business as usual, because make no mistake about this, the EU actually feel that they are doing this, as part of the EU, let us say, national interest. But you see, more and more, national interest is being interpreted in such a narrow manner, such that they do not see the broader perspective of committing more resources to actually stopping some of the elements, some of the factors that produce these refugees. For instance, the illicit support of draconian leaders in Africa, arming them because they make a whole lot of money in the sales of arms. These are things that run deeper than what we see in the surface, which is migration, because it is some of these actions that actually produce the migrants themselves. But of course, above all, blessings. The calling out has got to start with African leaders that know no other pockets than theirs, that actually strangulate the people, that actually ensure that, loud voices are quietened, a lot of people being killed, and so on and so forth, whether it is military regime or civilian regime. And also the whole notion of civilian coup d'etat, which, as a matter of fact, is actually playing out in the same Tunisia, and the EU is looking the other way. So all of these have got to be taken together to ensure that the EU and other Western powers begin to redefine their national interest to be broad enough to encompass help, and I mean concrete help, in these countries, because ultimately it will stop the flow of migration. Containment doesn't work. Build a wall as high as you want. Migrants will continue to be more desperate in climbing that wall that you have built with the intention of keeping them away. The time has come for a rethink.
Speaking of the migrants now, Collins, what would you say is the fate of these migrants? Now, we hear that because of these human rights violations, a lot of them have been stranded and some of them have even lost their lives. So what is the fate of the migrants as we speak?
Perilous. They continue to be in very, very serious danger. There was a recent report, Human Rights Watch report on the situation in Libya. Again, another country where the EU has pumped billions of euros to ensure that migrants are actually kept there, the applications ahead, as opposed to the rights granted to them under the Geneva Convention to seek asylum in countries that they consider to be safe. Now, by no standard can anybody consider Libya to be a safe country, yet the EU looks the other way and signs a deal with them that keeps migrants there. People have been raped, people have been killed, and sudden disappearances of individuals continue to be. So the modern day slavery, is a very huge thing, and those are the sort of fates that await people in those countries. And then, lastly, and perhaps even more importantly, blessings. It is important to support more campaign information in these, source countries, in the African countries where these migrants originate from, about the need to, concentrate on legal migration, because all the, illegal migration routes, human traffickers, and so on and so forth, they are not worth the trouble. I mean, but you see, some of these people, they know about the danger, but they feel, as a matter of fact, that they have no life in these African countries and that they are dead anyway. So rather than dying in those countries, and that is as bad as it is, rather than dying in their birth country, they would rather die, in the Mediterranean Sea or in the desert somewhere. So, we have to beef up the campaign information in the source countries.
All right, finally, Collins, let me quickly take us back to what I said earlier in my introduction. That saying of North Africa is not Africa. I know there was a time that, those in North Africa, especially Tunisia, always saw themselves as different from the rest of the Black Africans because of the geographical demarcation. Is it still a thing? And is it still, a heavy opinion, because looking at all these racial segregation and inhumane behavior towards the migrants, one would say that it stems from racism. Is it still something that they reckon with?
It is very much prevalent. If you consider blessings that not too long ago, one of the North African countries, I believe is Tunisia, Tunisia, actually applied to be a member of the European Union. Can you imagine that? An African country applying to be a member of the European Union. So there isn't less of it happening. There is more of it happening. And let me tell you what is at the center of it. This is pure identity crisis, number one. And number two, this is opportunism. Opportunism in the sense that, they have, looked at all the cards and the puzzle, and they feel that, leaning closer to the EU will be more beneficial to them, forgetting that that is a very, very wrong, assessment. So yes, racism is at the heart of it, but we also have opportunism, but also very serious identity crisis.
All right, global affairs analyst and former candidate of the European Parliament, Collins Nweke, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Always a blessing. Thank you very much, Blessings.
It's been a pleasure having you join us as well. Well, this is where we call it a wrap on Village Square Africa. It's been a very insightful and informative episode of VSA. Join us again next time as we bring you more interesting stories and insightful stories across the African continent. Of course, with me, Blessings Mosugu. Thanks for watching.